Hello again. It's quite an early one today. I have to be up about early to get on with some things. In the previous video, I mentioned that I briefly touch on some of the inconsistencies around the Epstein affair, and it's quite interesting. I'll try to look at three examples. If we look at Andrew, well, Colin, we'll use it, the 1917 anglicised veneer of Windsor, so Andrew Windsor. It seemed, firstly, in a previous video, I covered the fact that there's a long history of disgraceful behaviour from Andrew and his partner, shall we say, Sarah Ferguson. So it's very hard to believe that the Windsor firm or family, whatever you want to call them, didn't know about Andrew's conduct. They've been very quick to defend very dubious conduct in the past, and I think what you've seen is the scandal has got too close to them, so they've had to try to create this act where Andrew's being dealt with very severely. They can't go. They're a bit limited in how far they can go. They have to make it look harsh, but they can't go too far because Andrew would know too much about them. For instance, could taxpayers be encouraged to ask how much money was used to underwrite Charles's affair with Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen? How could we ask for our money back from his sham wedding, which cost a fortune to Diana back in the 1980s? Are we given the veneer that was for what Charles's conduct ultimately was? Why can't we have our money back? It was a facade. So they can only push him so far, but they have to make it look harsh. So it seems that the narrative on this is harshness on Andrew because he continued his association with Epstein after the conviction for child trafficking. Remember, in 2019, he was again facing charges. Hadn't gone to trial when he allegedly committed suicide. The cameras were faulty. The prison guards were internet shopping, snoozing, and so on, for just the exact moment that the suicide happened, of course. So he's facing a lot of pressure and criticism for maintaining contact after the first conviction up until the second, the charges that he was facing in 2019. It was understood that Epstein was planning on fighting those charges before he committed suicide in very bizarre circumstances, shall we say. So let's keep that framework then, and then move now to Jess Staley, who was fined and banned by the FCA for what they said is understating the nature of the closeness of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and that related to that, effectively, that same window between when he was convicted initially and then facing charges in New York in 2019. So that, and actually Staley popped up in one of the emails that the exchange between Andrew and Epstein, where Epstein was seeking to broker a meeting in London between Staley and Andrew. It didn't seem to happen. Whether it happened later, I'm not sure. I haven't read all the emails. So clearly there was an intention to discuss financial services activity in the UK with Staley, who was working for JP Morgan at the time. So if it's toxic to have continued an association with Epstein in that period between the convictions and the charges. Why was Staley ever allowed? Why was he authorised in the first place to take the Barclays CEO job? Because to me, because the FCA went down the route of, instead of just asking him, getting him to declare that he had no knowledge or had no involvement in any wrongdoing, they structured it around closeness. And that actually, as I've related in other videos, is connected to the past friction between him and the FCA over attempts to out a whistleblower. But really, if we're holding Andrew and others now to account of an association that continued Epstein past those convictions, then why was Staley ever allowed to become Barclays CEO? And why are the FCA not asking searching questions of JP Morgan? Because Staley was a very, very senior banker at JP Morgan, and to have handled the relationship, the level of Epstein, there would have been a line of accountability from Staley probably to the board, because it was that high profile, and Epstein is such a large financial figure in terms of the scale of his activities. But now, why aren't the FCA saying to JP Morgan, what did you know about Epstein, and how can you give us any assurances that Epstein's assets and money wasn't passed through London as well, our financial services system? So even that's the logical question you should ask. But it'll be interesting to see whether the secondary objective, the growth objective, put on the FCA and the financial services sector by nature, whether they'll be allowed to do that. Because surely you can't put it all. If you say it was toxic that period, then what about JP Morgan? What about their role? What about the accountability within their organisation? And did Epstein's assets pass through our financial services system? These are questions that should be asked, but I do wonder whether they actually will be asked. And it shows the arbitrary nature of all this, and how it's being bent to serve certain objectives. And of course, the third example is Peter Mandelson, who is seen, the contact between him and Epstein went on even further than what was previously thought, where when he was sacked from his role as ambassador to the US. And of course, according to Super Peter Kyle, our intrepid business secretary now, Starmer took a punt on Mandelson's talent, and he knew about a relationship with Epstein, but now it's been seen to have gone much further and longer in duration. Mandelson is still able to carry his title. Nothing's happened about his title. So, and I wonder why that is. And isn't it strange how after Mandelson's sacking, we started getting a stream of very damaging links against Keir Starmer. So there's a lot of intrigue in this. I just want to, before I sign off, remind you of a few things. When you wrote the book Lost the Races, there was a lot of criticism came in, blah 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 blah, and it made me laugh in many respects. But people actually read it and looked at it, and you can see that they should be able to see if they're right enough that everything that was in there was for a reason. Because we hinted in it. I mean, the Epstein case is awful. I don't want to trivialise it and offend anyone, but sadly it involved trafficking vulnerable people. which is an interest which is we've linked to private assets. And I don't mean that, you know, trivializing these things and laughing. I was just laughing at the way people often don't join very simple dots together. And it's no coincidence that the rape gang inquiry is taking so long to begin, because it will implicate, we've seen this business model, we know it, social services, local authority officials, legal professionals, court officials, and private equity who they were ultimately traded through to. And this model still exists. There's a Sky feature that covers this in relation to a tragic incident of a young girl recently. And this model is very much still in full figure. They're trying to keep it a little bit suppressed. Remember, who asked for Pisces? Who lobbied for Pisces? This opaque trading platform. It was private equity. Many of the organisations that are implicated in now the trafficking of vulnerable people, whether they be young people or elderly people, through the local authority system, through the court system, into the hands of private equity, where they become cash generative assets. It all links together, and we've got a lot to do on this. And we've put a lot of people on watch, and they know it's coming. They're hiding. They think we're calling their bluff. And we've had the coordinated coercion from the regulator and the local authorities, and we're ready. And the other thing as well, you might want to look at is, back in the book Lost the Races, the BBC, I'm afraid, does have quite a history of biased reporting and electoral, what I would interpret as election interference. And indeed, I provide an example of that with Justin Webb and Mariana Spring. Now, there's a reason we included Mariana Spring, which I'll probably come to in the future. She's a very, very interesting character, and we may well cover her holistic role in due course, because it's quite interesting. She was in there for a reason. It wasn't an accident, I can assure you. On Ukraine, keep your eyes out. As I said in that last chapter, whilst you are still being flooded with the narrative that victory to Ukraine, victory to the Ukraine, I told you back in 2024, unless they were willing to put NATO troops into Ukraine, which the Europeans and the UK have desperately tried to trigger provocation to try and pull the United States into the conflict in that way. But unless that happened, Ukraine wouldn't get its land back. And and I also said that Zelensky will ultimately seem very different than his role was presented then. And I draw your attention to some very nasty emerging corruption scandals around his inner circle. And ultimately, when this is all over, if Zelensky survives in whatever form, I'm not saying I want anything to happen to him, but I'm aware of the difficulties and challenges he faces. There'll be some very difficult questions for Zelensky in terms of what ultimately has happened to the billions of pounds and dollars and euros that have flowed through Ukraine, and the wealth of him and his associates. Right, that's it for now. So take care.